Hey YouTube, Do-It-Yourself Junkie here, and today I'm going to do my first video on how to sew. And this video is just how to set up the machine, and then I'll do a follow-on video on how to do basic stitches and lock in and stuff. So I'll get started on this one with setting up the machine, and each machine is going to be slightly different, but this will give you an idea of what you need to do to start sewing. First thing is, we're going to need to put our foot pedal onto the machine. Basically, the foot pedal, like the name says, goes on the floor, and then it should have some sort of plug that'll plug somewhere into the machine. This one's nice. It also has an on-off switch. That's on, that's off. And before you plug it into the wall, you'll want to make sure that it's in the off position. So every machine I've dealt with does what I think is called the running stitch. And basically, you have a top thread and a bottom thread, and the stitch is formed by just looping those two pieces of thread together like that. And this junction right here where the two pieces are happens in the middle of the two pieces of fabric, or the two layers of fabric, and then the thread comes out of the hole, goes across the fabric, and then goes back in the next hole. And I'll show you how that stitch is formed in a minute. But first, because you have two sources of thread, obviously your top thread comes from a spool up here, but your bottom thread is going to be coming out of what is known as a bobbin. Here's a plastic bobbin, and the bobbin goes inside the bobbin holder, which is this thing, and that usually goes under the needle plate. And so to get the thread on the bobbin, you need to wind it, since as far as I know, there's not preloaded bobbins, and they're reusable, so why the heck would you go out and buy a preloaded one anyway? So you just take your spool of thread and you take some thread off of it and you wind it onto the bobbin. And stuff is going to be slightly different from machine to machine, but it's basically the same no matter what. So usually you have a winder for bobbins. It'll be something short like this, and for this one you stick the bobbin on there, and then you push it to the side to engage the drive for the bobbin winder. And then this piece right here just controls how much thread builds up on the bobbin before this pushes it out, and it's no longer being driven by the machine. And then the machine I'm using is pretty cool. It has a function where pulling this out disengages the needle. So when that's pushed in, everything moves. When you pull this out, it disengages the drive down here. So the bobbin is spinning, but nothing down there is moving. And I don't have a small spool to put on here, but you'd put a spool here, take the thread across to this tension holder, and then back to the bobbin. And then I'll show you how to put the thread onto the bobbin to start the winding. So first I'm going to bring my thread over here, and you heard that little snap noise. That was me putting it under that tension holder, and it just keeps tension on this thread so you don't have to hold it. And then see, it's going to rotate clockwise to wind the thread. So what we'll do is you take your thread, you want to go over here on the back side, since it's winding counterclockwise or clockwise, and do 5 or 6 loops with the loose end. Then you feed that loose end through one of the holes in the top. Now that you have the thread started, just hold the loose end and wind it a few turns, and it'll travel up and down the bobbin, and once it does that at least once, it's locked in. And then you can just trim this loose end off. Normally I use a pair of scissors, but I kind of misplaced them, so we'll just use a knife there. And then theoretically you could sew like this too. You push the knob back in to engage the needle and everything, and you have your machine threaded. But on your first bobbin, you need to wind it by itself. Here in a little bit, it'll build up enough thread that you'll see it stop spinning. And this one I overloaded a little bit. This is slightly out of adjustment. You don't want too much thread on your bobbin, otherwise it won't feed out of the bobbin holder correctly. So we'll get rid of a little bit of it. So right there, it's just below the edges of the bobbin holder, and usually haven't had any trouble with it being like that. So from here, you cut the thread, and then holding the bobbin in this orientation, you want the thread to be wrapping clockwise or unwrapping counterclockwise. And here is the slot that the thread goes into, and it kind of angles back that direction. That always helps me remember when I pull this in the unwrapping direction, it just feed naturally into that slot. And that's how you set up your bobbin and bobbin holder. And now usually there's somewhere to access where the bobbin goes, and always make sure the needle is at the top of its travel. And usually you'll know that it's at the top of its travel by this take-up arm being at the top of its travel as well. When it's in that orientation, that's when you can stick the bobbin in here, and you want about 4 inches of thread sticking out. And you should hear it click in there, and this arm right here will have spring tension on it. And this is how you remove the bobbin. You pull out this arm and it unlocks it. So when you're pushing it in, there's a click, and that's that arm latching onto this shaft in there. And then you just leave that thread loose. Next step is you have to thread your machine. On this machine, I actually have a diagram where to take the thread. So you come off the spool, which I don't have, and you come across here, and then down underneath this hook, and then down this slot is number 1. And then number 2 is around the bottom of this and back up. Number 3 is through this take-up lever or arm, and then back down. And then number 4 is down to this thread holder on the needle, and then through the eye of the needle and out the back. And if your machine, the eye is facing sideways, you want to pay attention to make sure whether it's feeding left to right or right to left, because that will make the thread break if you feed it in the wrong direction. So real quick, I'm going to thread the machine. You might not be able to see it since I need to put the camera down. through this in the wrong way. Back down. Okay, and it's very important to keep a length of extra thread here and kind of feed that under the presser foot and out the back of the machine. If you have that too short, when the needle goes down, this thread is going to be pulled up, and if you have it too short, it'll pull out of the needle. And then real quick, we'll cover how this machine forms that loop and why there's two sets of thread. So you have your top thread up here and your bobbin thread right there. As the needle comes down, there's a hook right here that's moving, and then basically the needle's all the way down, and that hook's going to start to come back, and it's going to grab that thread on the needle. And right there, it's dragging. You can't see it in there. It's just starting to come across, but that hook is dragging the top thread down in a loop. See, it's coming across right there. And it's going to go across the face of the bobbin. And you can see it going across. And there, the hook released it. And now it's coming up, and it's looped around this bobbin thread. And it's going to pull both of them up into the fabric, and right there it's starting to come out of the needle plate, and that's the top of its stroke. And if there was fabric in there, this two loops would be, hopefully, if you've got the tension set correctly, in between the two layers of fabric that you're sewing together. But that's what you want to do after you get the top threaded. You want to hold some tension on this thread and then run it down and grab the bottom thread and pull it up through the needle plate, and then both of them go to the rear of the machine like this. And you want about 5 to 6 inches of that. So that's how that is formed. And then a little while, I'll go back, open this back up as I run some fabric through there, and you can see it moving. But for right now, we'll put the machine back together. Next step that you'll want to do is set tension. And there's two ways to set tension. And you want the tension basically between the bottom and the top thread to be equal to where that loop, interlocking loop, is in the middle of your two pieces of fabric. And the two places to set tension is here for the top thread, and then for the bottom thread, on the bobbin holder where the thread comes out, there's a spring that has a screw on it. And basically that's where the more you screw in the screw, the tighter the spring presses on the thread, the higher the bottom thread tension is. And I was taught the correct tension is where you could let go of the bobbin and it would slowly descend down the thread, kind of like a spider dropping down. The only thing I'll say is that works great if you have a metal bobbin. But if you have one of these plastic ones, they're much lighter, and it's near impossible to set the tension that way using that method. So if you get one of these, I'd be tempted to sew with it first and then mess with it later if you can't get the proper tension on the top. And tension varies with thread type and also with material type that you're sewing through. And basically you'll want to select thread and needle size to match the type of fabric that you're sewing. You wouldn't want a huge needle running little thread. You want a tiny needle running huge thread. On the first, if you're running real thin thread on a huge needle, you're probably jabbing giant holes in whatever fabric, delicate fabric that you're sewing. Now if you're running a tiny needle with really thick thread, the thread can bind on the eye of the needle and cause it to break, and also cause tension problems. And as far as correct tension goes, here's the correct tension. I ran the bottom in tan and the top in black so you could see. And right here at each hole, there's a little piece of brown thread poking through. Almost too high of a tension on the top thread, but on the bottom at each hole you just have a little bit of the black thread thrown. So that's pretty good. That's about equal tension. Here in the middle two, I have the top thread tension set to loose, and basically there's no brown thread showing at any of the holes in the fabric. But on the bottom side, the brown thread is almost a straight line with black thread looped over it. And that's a sign of too little tension on the top. And then the opposite is true for too much tension on the top. You have the black thread here is almost a straight line, it's not going down, and then there's brown thread poking through, just looped over what looks like a straight line of black thread laying on top of the fabric. And then on the bottom, there's really not any black thread poking up through the fabric here. So on this one, the top tension is either too high or the bottom tension is too low. On this one, the bottom tension is too high or the top tension is too low. And basically on the bottom, screw down tighter increases tension, loosening it loosens tension. But there is a limited amount. There's not very many thread. It's on that screw, so you have to be careful with how much you adjust it. And then on top, you're just limited by how much this dial can move. And the higher number, the higher the tension. And on a new machine, if you're sewing something light or normal, you should be at about a 4. I'm sewing some pretty heavy fabric, so I'm cranked up a little bit higher than you're probably using at home. And that's how you set up the sewing machine. Hope you liked the video. Please subscribe, please hit the like button, and come back and watch my next video where I'll start showing you how to do a basic stitch.